Griffin. I'm the Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at DSST Public Schools. I'm also the CEO and co-founder of Prosperity Educators LLC. We specialize in diversity, equity, inclusion, development coaching, leadership coaching, strategic planning, and organizational planning. So what happened is throughout my career, I noticed early on while I was in college that I wanted to teach, even though I was an engineering major and I had even switched to architecture and moved back. I ultimately wanted to teach. I didn't actually want to go out in the field to be an engineer. I was hoping to go ahead and become a college professor. But ultimately, my third year in Prairie View, I transitioned to becoming an English major. Should have listened to my freshman composition teacher back when I was a freshman, who implored me to major in English because of my ability to write. So I went on and changed majors, became an English teacher, an English major, and while as an English major, I also doubled or minored in history. So I noticed a correlation between English and history. And being at an HBCU, a lot of our education is culturally responsive and culturally relevant and very multicultural. So we look at multiple viewpoints. Going into the English classroom in Aldine, I noticed a curriculum is what we would call whitewashed and very gender normative around patriarchy. So I immediately started embedding a lot of the learnings I had at Prairie View, some of our African American history, women, literature, women's history, women's literature, because our population was highly Hispanic. I also started incorporating a lot of Latin American and Hispanic American history, going all the way back to the Mayans and Aztecs and things like that, right there in the English classroom. And I started learning that a lot of what I was doing had those frameworks behind them. And once I started learning about those frameworks, then I applied those in my latter years as an assistant principal. Moving into the principalship, I vowed that as a principal, I would still do this work. However, in studying the literature and the research, I noticed that there was very, very minimum scholarship or spaces for practitioners, such as myself, P12 or K-12 practitioners. So I vowed that as a principal, and when I finished my PhD, I would be one of those people who would bridge theory to practice. So I would take theory, put it into practice, train staff to implement these from a practice perspective, from a teacher perspective, from an administrator perspective, a counseling perspective, and at the same time, write about it. Instead of someone researching me and finding out how I did these things, I wanted to write about it. Even though I'm a P12, I'm an educator, and there are several chapters that are coming from an educational perspective. What I appreciate about the chapters is they actually talk about it not only from an educational perspective, but outside of education. So there are multiple chapters that are not about education. It's about industry. Like there's one in Turkey that talks about the telecommunications industry and its impact on women from a gender perspective. There's a chapter there's one of our authors is a white woman who is Muslim who wears a hijab and talks about that experience and that intersectionality inside that chapter. So beyond education, beyond the DEI practitionership, this book is relevant to industry. It's relevant to law enforcement. It's relevant to banks. It's relevant to hospitals. It's relevant to anyone who wants to engage and get a perspective, a personal perspective on what it's like to try to implement DEI, period. So the relevancy of this book is talking about, there's a chapter that specifically talks about how to develop a DEI practitioner. Because what's happening right now is we have companies who are adding this role and really don't know how to develop that role. And I'm just going to say that just as transparent and plain as possible. People don't know how to develop this role. Then you have people who are going to be put in these roles who don't know how to ask for development in that role, because this is all relatively new. And in many ways, some of it is performative. This book moves beyond performance. What you're going to see in this book, if you're someone who wants to add this role, and if you're someone who wants to see how can we do this well, our book, there are chapters in there that can help you with that. One, there's a chapter, like I said, about the DEI practitioner. Then there's chapters about gender. Then there's chapters about religion. There's one chapter called Leading Boldly. that you have to be intentional with this work. It can't be we're going to do this right now until everything calms down. It isn't going to calm down. This book is not a calm down book. This book is very intentional, very purposeful, and very specific. And every single chapter speaks to experiences of the authors. It speaks to experiences of those studied by the authors, and it speaks to calls to action. Like, here's a framework you can use. This is what has happened, and this is what needs to come. The issue is, and the nuances I found is that taking theory and putting it into practice from a practitioner perspective. It's one thing for someone to tell me that based on the research, this is what you should be doing, versus based on the research and examples, this is what you can do, and this is the potential outcome. We got to start to look at it from the practitioner perspective. So once we got these chapters together, that's what you see. You see the theory, you see the research, you see the framework, but then you see some of like there's a couple where you're going to see the I statements versus one versus the research versus it's I did this. This is what I discovered. And I applaud some of our authors to do that, to get away from that nuance of always saying it has to be so objective. Yes, we understand objective for validity and all of that. But if I'm telling you my story and I'm telling you what I went through and I'm telling you how I did this, I should be able to speak from my perspective. Like, look at the critical race theory, look at the study on whiteness, look at the studies, the intersectionality around special education, social emotional learning from a culturally responsive perspective, not just social emotional learning, but from a culturally responsive perspective. Looking at the word inclusion and how inclusion was first a special education term and is now being transitioned and is now being used in a multitude of ways. Those are some of the things that I ask you to look at, have an open mind. And if you're a senior scholar or a scholar or a researcher who's really grounded in the theory and the methodology, I'm asking you, open your mind up, because this is a way for theory, research, and practice to come together. Include the practitioner. We have a lot to say, we have a lot to write about, and we do have the skill set. We have the ability, if given the platform and if given the opportunity. And I feel like that's what we accomplished with this book.
Suitable for use in your course syllabus and as an integral resource for research advancements within your department, this publication should be included within your institution's library along with these related publications. Offered in print, ebook, print plus ebook, and as a part of IGI Global's Emphasize Books, this publication is available for purchase directly through IGI Global's online bookstore, as well as many other major booksellers and platforms, such as EBSCOhost, Gobi, ProQuest, and Oasis. Recommend to your librarian today.